Hello, and welcome to the latest in a series of podcasts from us here at Groundsure. My name is David Kempster. I'm the Marketing Director here at Groundsure, and I'm delighted to welcome today Stephen Sykes, who's a freelance environmental lawyer, works for various city law firms, advising them on ESG and environmental risk. Today we're going to be talking about the latest Law Society guidance on climate risk, which has been out for a few weeks, and we're going to review its main contents and the implications for conveyancers and commercial real estate lawyers in terms of how to implement the key points of the guidance itself and how you can help advise clients better in the transaction. So firstly, Stephen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, David.
And first question really is, from your perspective, what are the kind of key points that have come out from the guidance? And I guess, how did we get here in the first place?
Well, the process from the climate resolution that the Law Society issued in October 2021 to the new guidance, which was issued on the 19th of April 2023, fairly speedy turnaround for the Law Society to produce an incredibly comprehensive guidance, which looks at two areas really. It looks at the responsibilities that we as solicitors owe to our clients to warn them about climate risk. That's at the heart of it for anybody involved in real estate, which is a core part of my practice. And then there's another area which is also pretty important, which is the climate impact, if you like, the carbon impact of the law firm itself as a business. And the overall message in this guidance for lawyers is take it more seriously. We're not doing enough. Step up to the plate, understand your duties, and ensure that you comply.
So what has been the kind of the major driver for this? What has been the impact in the market as you see it that's brought us to here?
Okay, so the major physical driver behind all this is the climate crisis that we're in the thick of, and alongside that, some work that actually organisations including Groundsure have done by instructing leading barristers to pinpoint this key question, which is what are our responsibilities as lawyers in relation to climate risk? Should we be advising our clients about it or shouldn't we? And the steer from the Law Society that's come back very emphatically is absolutely. The law is actually fairly settled on these core duties, but they've never really been applied to the phenomena of climate change. But when you think through what the impact of that is on land and buildings, it's so significant. There was an inevitability about this guidance, actually, that in time we were going to have a steer from our professional body to help us understand and explain to our clients what the impacts are, because it goes to the heart of the value of a property transaction. You buy a climate impacted asset, it's going to be worth less. It might be worth nothing. It might be, if it's coastal erosion, it could be destroyed. So these are important areas, and the Law Society, I think, is to be commended for producing this guidance, albeit it's rather long.
Yes, I believe they're the first legal organisation in the world to issue this guidance, and that came off the back of the resolution after the COP26, didn't it? So there's definitely been a process here, I think, that's come through.
It didn't happen from nowhere. So the Law Society set up a climate change working party in 2020. And as you say, it's ahead of the curve compared to other professional legal associations around the world. But they're looking at what the Law Society has produced, and some of them will no doubt modify it for their own purposes. But climate change is a global phenomenon. They'll need their guidance as well. So this has been coming for some time. The team that worked on it, it was over 12 months of very hard, intense work to produce this guidance and get it through the various approval processes, including it's got the stamp of the SRA on it as well, with all their enforcement responsibilities, albeit they've got a little bit of latitude with how they respond to this guidance. But it does consider SRA principles and how they apply to us as solicitors. So it's really important guidance that we all need to read, understand, and then comply with. That's probably the tricky bit.
Now, Stephen, you mentioned about the key duties. What particular duties does this touch on then that conveyancers need to be aware of?
Okay, I mean, the overarching duty is to advise the client about climate risk. Linked to that is a duty to warn the client about climate risk. Some clients are more sophisticated, probably more switched on about this risk than others. You've got the difference between, if you like, the large property PLCs that have been alongside this for years. But even in that case, the lawyer can't say nothing. There's still a responsibility to inform the client about it, to the other end of the spectrum, if you like, which is someone that probably hasn't really worked this through yet, and it may be encountering it for the sort of first time, and the lawyer has to do even more with clients that are less switched on about this than otherwise. But it's a duty to warn, it's a duty to advise. If in the course of a transaction you encounter information about climate risk, we've got a duty to disclose that to our client, and typically in a report on title, a certificate of title. So the duties, like I say, they're fairly well understood. They've not been applied to climate before. The general view from myself as an environmental lawyer and other environmental lawyers is there's nothing too remarkable about this other than that it's set down in writing from our professional body for the first time. And that gives it added seriousness, because if we fall short of those duties, that could lead to professional liability, increased PI claims and the rest of it.
Now, at the time of recording, the guidance came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago. You've had your ear to the ground. What have you picked up in terms of the response and the views from the market? And by the market, I mean high street conveyancers up to big city law firms doing commercial transactions. What's been the spread of views?
There's a sense that whilst the guidance isn't perfect, there was an inevitability about it, and it's not a bad start. It's a stake in the ground. It's overarching guidance. It's going to be followed by more guidance in the future. If you are a residential conveyancer, you're probably thinking, blimey, I've got even more to do. This can on first glance look like it's an onerous responsibility. Actually, when you dig into it, I don't think it necessarily is. But that's been one reaction, which is, oh no, we've got even more to do, and we're pretty beleaguered anyway. Some of the large commercial law firms that I've worked with, I think are taking a different view, that when you see how much land and buildings across the UK are going to be impacted by this, it's something which is a significant issue for clients, of course, and those law firms will, I think, by and large, embrace it and frankly get on with it, put their processes and procedures in place, and not treat this as, a massive issue. There's a way through this. Of course there is, by a number of relatively simple steps. So we've got, and probably the vast majority of lawyers wouldn't necessarily comment on forums about this. They'll read it and they'll reflect. It may be that some of those that are vocal are in a small minority. It's hard to say, David, but the reaction's quite widespread. Most environmental lawyers will welcome it for sure, because we're close to this issue as environmental lawyers, and we think our professional body should be giving us a steer on it. Residential conveyancers, I say, some areas of negativity, I can understand that completely, but actually this issue is so substantial and so significant that this guidance is inevitable, and we just have to accept it.
Taking the sort of the larger commercial law firms, this has been on their radar for a while, largely due to some ESG litigation risks issues that they've been picking up. So it's understandable that perhaps these have been the early adopters, those that have been thinking about it a little bit more. So in practical terms for PSLs out there, what are the steps that they need to be thinking about in terms of how they're adopting this as a form of policy now with regard to advising clients on climate risk?
Well, looking at the guidance, it's quite clear on what the duties are. It's a little less clear on what you need to do to discharge those duties. So we're promised further guidance, particularly in relation to real estate. It might be a few months away though. For the PSL community, do you wait, or do you have to engage with this process and work it through for yourself? And when you do that, and I've been helping some law firms to do that, first and foremost, you have to consider the climate search, which I know in Groundssure's case is integrated into the core environmental search, because frankly, any site could be exposed to climate risk. If you were to take a view that we'll do it in some cases and not in others, I think that's really risky, and it's a tough call because, like I say, any site in the UK could be exposed to the risk of increased flooding, coastal erosion, and the other physical risks that climate can manifest over time. So I think get familiar with the climate searches, choose a climate search, use your different criteria on who's been leading the way in this area, what support they've got to provide you with when you are advising clients, because there is some novelty to this. You don't just buy a report, you'll need a little bit of help as well. In the case of Groundsure, I know there are the climate searches, search the conditions and climate clauses to help lawyers report back to clients. That's all part of that approach. I think first and foremost, as I say, it's the climate search. Then when you commission a report and it comes back with a climate rating for the site, in many cases that may be that there's no issue at all, but where there is an issue, you have to tell your client what to do about it. And the climate clauses at Groundsure are quite useful in that regard. And just document this in a systematic way. And then you've got to train your fee earners. Everyone has to be trained on the nature of this risk. And it is a serious risk, and it will affect a huge amount of UK real estate. It's not a marginal, 1 in a million risk. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sites around the UK that by 2050 are going to be worth less because of climate risk. So of course you've got to engage with this.
And I think it's important. You made the point about the residential conveyancer voice was in part saying, "Oh no, here's another thing." And I think we all have enormous sympathy with the fact that things like the Building Safety Act and some of the issues around that, there is a great pressure bearing down on the conveyancers in terms of the perception of a lot to think about and a lot of extra processes. I think the important thing that we wanted to emphasise that climate data, by putting it in the environmental search like we have, the climate index analysis module is in our main environmental searches. It means that it's already there. There's no additional outlay, there's no additional process. The only process I think that we're looking to, as you've rightly said, Stephen, encourage conveyancers to do is to lift and shift the information that's in the report into some standard clauses formats. Now, we've been engaging with the Chancery Lane project on their Marnie's clause, which has been in existence for a couple of years. And there's some degree of adaptation and implementation of the spirit of that clause. And I think we're going to be uniting the work around that so that conveyancers and real estate lawyers have that confidence that they can report in a standardized way for clients. And I think that's really important, isn't it? So there's a simple, clear process.
Yeah. I guess folks listening to this may or may not have heard of the Chancery Lane project, but they're referenced in the climate guidance, the Law Society's climate guidance. And for a few years now, they've been helping lawyers with what's called the just transition to a low carbon world, the net zero world that hopefully will be in by 2050, if not sooner, and working through standard clauses for all the legal work across that spectrum, but particularly including real estate. And the first version of their reporting clause assumed that the solicitor wouldn't be commissioning a climate search. Well, the world's changed. Climate searches came out last June with Groundsure. It's not far off a year now. So actually you will be commissioning a climate search. What should you be reporting on it is the challenge. And you're right, the Marnie clause is being revised to reflect that. Law firms and their PSLs can look at these precedents and take their own view. They can either adopt and follow, and that's fine, or modify. I think the primary challenge with all of this is not to be spooked by it and to just keep it simple. Choose your search provider, get training, understand the core issues, report back to the client, including various options. There could be some options where there's a price cut because climate's going to impact over the next few decades or so. It could be there's a decision not to buy in extreme cases. These are calls for the client ultimately, commercially. It's not to say that any lawyer is a climate expert. We're not. But this is another report. It's a particularly important one. And there are legal repercussions if we don't commission it, and legal repercussions for our clients if they buy blind. We don't want to put them in that position. It's a solution.
Absolutely. And from our perspective, we don't see this as any different from the 15 to 20 years prior to this of conveyancers and commercial real estate lawyers looking at contaminated land reports, looking at flood risk reports, and passing the information on to clients. Essentially, it's the same thing, but looking forward into the future, relying on the same reliance and using the same guidance that's contained within the reports. And in its simplest terms, that's what we're saying to the conveyancing market now, that it's to adopt climate information in exactly the same way. It's providing that 30-year, in our case, view ahead, and linking that to standard clauses that you can then communicate to the client. So that's, from our perspective, what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, and you're right to couch it in those terms, David, because essentially the physical risks in a climate search are similar, if not identical, to those that are in the traditional environmental search. You know, climate change, what does it result in? It results in more coastal erosion. Coastal erosion is in the environment research, but it's looking forward. Is there going to be more coastal erosion because we've got a warming climate with the more extreme weather events and rising sea levels? You bet, absolutely, there's going to be more coastal erosion. Same goes for flooding. It's going to be 20% more flooding. It's a significant risk affecting 5 million properties. The models are showing it's going to be 6 million by 2050. Another million more properties. That's the scale of this. It's not like it's an afterthought, a footnote. It's so significant that we have to step up. And as the guidance, the core message from the guidance is take this seriously, both as a law firm, as a business, and take it seriously for your clients. Because if you don't, there are exposures. We professional exposures, and there could be repercussions. It's in now. It's not going away. We can't bury our heads in the sand. We just have to find a simple way through it to organisations like Groundsure that have been quite close to this process and have a core part of the solution.
What's your sense of where this is going to go as well? I mean, lenders' responses, I think, is really important to this in the transaction, and we await to see in the market how they will respond and whether there's a greater requirement through the conveyancing handbooks to triage the risks on their behalf, and I think that's probably the simplest way that they will respond. So that's a key thing, but also things like transition risks as well. That's an area that I know lenders are particularly focused on. So what's your take on that and how that could evolve?
My take is that some may have read in the press quite recently that the Bank of England stress tested the major banks in the UK and the major insurance companies to say, in effect, have you got a handle on climate risk? And you know the magnitude of this. And it always concentrates minds when you put a number on that. And the number is £525 billion of credit risk exposure by 2050 is coming the way of banks from climate change. It's so significant. So the stress test is, do you have a balance sheet strong enough to withstand all that? So, of course, banks are onto this ahead of lawyers. They've been onto this for a few years now. And the pressure starts to then cascade down because they don't want to be lending on assets that are going to fall into the sea, that are going to be less valuable because they flood every year, or that have subsidence issues on a major basis. Bearing in mind, just last summer we were at 40 degrees centigrade for the first time in history, recorded history anyway, in the UK. And if you're on clay soil, guess what? That means like a 4-fold increase in subsidence claims last year compared to the norm. So it's here already. Banks are mindful of that, and they'll put the pressure on and potentially find there'll be sites that won't be mortgageable because of climate risk. In fact, we're probably already there on it. So there's pressures coming from all directions, David. There's the Law Society. It's not exactly a pressure; it's a clarification. Could have been a little clearer, but we're promised this sector-specific guidance. And all in all, what they did is, I think, it's broadly to be welcomed.
Yeah. Excellent. I mean, you made an important point around training and support, and I think you mentioned around the area of risks with the firm and potential exposure and litigation if there's a failure to follow those duties. And I think the engagement we're getting with COLPS as well is that they're getting increasingly interested in this space, and it's becoming a potential risk register issue. So that's certainly an area, I think, for COLPS to now start be thinking about the wider implications to the firm and its impact on the fiduciary duties to directors, for example, in the law firm. So what do you think around that space?
Well, I think when you have duties enshrined in guidance from the Law Society, as I say, the duties themselves aren't that controversial. We've known about duties of care, of course, as lawyers, and duties to warn and duties to disclose. Some of that's in the SRA rules, 6.4, the duty to disclose. We've known about it, but it's applied to climate risks for the first time. And a compliance officer will be concerned if any duty is breached. There's a greater chance of duties are breached if you're unaware of it. So, of course, you absolutely have to read the guidance, but there's also a chance of liability if you don't do anything. So you have to read it, understand it, and put these simple processes in place to meet that duty. Otherwise, a compliance officer, yes, will be concerned. These are medium to long-term exposures. By the time they've manifested, and perhaps a site that's been bought for X 100,000 or X million is worth less because of climate, that's when, if I can use the phrase, that's when the rubber hits the road, essentially. And, you know, the number of sites at climate risk, that's going to happen. And the way you protect against that is taking reasonable steps to comply with your duty a completely reasonable step is to buy an environmental report that includes embedded within it a climate search. Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you do that for every single site? Why would you take a risk? Any compliance officer is going to think, actually, there's a ready-made solution here. We have to follow it. If we don't, we're exposed.
Yeah.
So it's not actually that difficult to ponder. Do you commission climate searches in some cases and not in others? No, you do it in every single case.
Yeah. And that's one of the arguments around, shall I take it out of the retainer? Therein danger lies, doesn't it, in terms of potential litigation and failure to advise the client?
It does. Point about the retainer is basically, if lawyers are to say, I'm not advising my client on climate risk, you can't just keep that to yourself. You have to explain that to the client. There has to be a full discussion around it. They need to agree to that. I've seen counsel's opinion. It's a counsel's opinion from Groundsure. Stephen Troman's about a year ago said, yes, the client's full consent is needed if you're going to carve it out. So when you work through that process, you're saying, here's a risk. Actually, it's fairly significant. No, by the way, I'm not advising you on it. When I've got there's a relatively simple solution to it, the commission the search and report on it. Why on earth would anybody take that position? So if lawyers are running from this and trying to find a way, out of it by not engaging in it, by not getting trained on it, then they're not taking it seriously in the spirit of the guidance. And I think that doesn't lead to a happy scenario, because ultimately the client's going to be left high and dry on what is, I think, a material risk. Probably the most material of all the environmental risks is climate, because it affects more land more drastically than any other environmental risk. So you've got to engage and take it seriously.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to mull over for a law firm from the top right through to the departments. But ultimately, when you boil it down for conveyancing, it's a relatively straightforward consideration. The data's there. The way to explain that outcome from the data is there in a standardized way. It's just about implementing a process and demonstrating that perhaps internally to the COLP to say, we're covered off. So, that's what we want to try and achieve. Groundsure as an organisation has launched a number of webinars. We've got in-house training that we can do with firms, and we're engaging also with not only COLPs through organisations such as Legal Eye, but we're also looking at the regional law societies with a series of programs to support them as well. So we're very active as an organisation to help roll out not only understanding about the guidance, but practical ways to comply with that too. So that's essentially it for today's podcast. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us today. Lots to consider and think about. If you want to know more about the guidance itself, we've produced a handy guide that summarises the guidance, which is available on our website. Just go across to groundsure.com/climate index and you'll see it there. And stay tuned for more instalments and updates on the guidance and other podcasts in the future. Thanks for your time and see you soon.